Good morning, Cooperative Education students. This is Katie Birch, the DC 030 instructor for Creating Opportunities through Co-op. We are almost more than halfway through our coursework before we can start collecting work placement hours. We're on topic 7, and we're talking today about unions and collective bargaining. So some of you might be familiar with unions, some of you might not be. So we're going to sort of go through the ins and outs of being part of a union, not being part of a union. Reminder that classes are Monday to Thursday, 9 a.m. Central, 10 a.m. Eastern. Please don't be shy. Reach out to me if you need help. You can call me on my cell, which is listed below. You can text me. You can email me. Don't get lost. Give me a call. Don't just leave it, because the sooner you get through this coursework, the sooner you can start collecting those placement hours. All right, what are we covering today? We are covering what is a union. We're going to talk about strikes. We're going to talk about lockouts. We're going to talk about the myths and realities of unions. We are going to talk a little bit about collective bargaining. What does that mean? Are you part of a union? Are you not part of a union? And then we're going to finish the class off because there's an assignment that you need to do at the end where you need to interview a union or non-union member. Both, actually. So I'm actually going to bring in a friend of mine who's worked both for a union and for a non-union. She's currently working for KO, a non-union member. And we're going to talk about the benefits and drawbacks of being unionized versus non-unionized. So let's dive right into our classwork. We're going to go to our Google Classroom to find it. And we are finding under classwork, we're going to go to topic 7. So exciting that we're getting through this. Okay, so what you should know about unions and collective bargaining. So here's a story about the NBA, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with the National Basketball Association, or maybe you're a fan. So you might have heard the term lockout. So for 161 days, so that's 3, 6, 9, 12, 16, 5 months, owners of the NBA prevented their players from training, from playing, or being traded because they could not agree on the salaries players should earn. So what happened was a lockout happened, and it delayed the start of the 2011-12 season, and it also reduced the number of games played. Normally 82 games a season are played, down to 66. Okay, so a lockout situation is when an employer prevents employees from working. Lockouts and strikes, when employees stop working on their own, are just some of the tools used by employers and employees to negotiate contracts and conditions that satisfy both parties. Some would say this is a great strategy. Some would say this is a terrible strategy. That's why we're interviewing someone today, because we're going to dive into it a little bit more. So sometimes it's difficult to understand what's going on in a lockout or a strike. Maybe you wonder why the different demands can't be met and why the public should have to suffer. Like, one good example is the post office. Anytime they're negotiating a contract, you will find the post office will strike at the busiest time of year, which, you guessed it, is Christmas. So why is this happening? Why can't they just talk about it? So in this topic, we're going to find out more about the purpose of negotiating satisfactory work conditions and wages, and the role that unions have in fighting for better work conditions for Canadians. And unions have a very long history, and it was something that was needed way back when, especially with people who were working in factory and construction, because a lot of their needs were not being met. And the only way to come to a conclusion was to gather together and stop working until the employers would hear what they had to say. So what is a union? So a union is an organization of workers in an industry who come together to fight for better working conditions. So basically, being a member of a union, you get a say in how your workplace is run. You get to have a say in the hours of work, how much you get paid. You get to have a say in the benefits, like health and disability insurance, and also working conditions and safety standards. So even if there's legislation in place to guarantee your rights, not all employers follow the law. So that's when a union can help and make sure that companies comply with the current legislation that protects your rights and work. So what unions do is they work together to come together to achieve something called a collective agreement. And a collective agreement is a written contract that sets out working conditions for all employees and employers to follow. Okay. And that way, if the employer or employees are not following those conditions, then you as an employee or the employer can file a formal complaint about the workplace, which is called a grievance. So if you work in an ununionized environment, sometimes you still have to pay union dues. Okay. Even if you choose not to be a union member. This is because Canadian labor laws state that even if you are not a member of a union, you'll benefit from the union's agreement with your employer. So even if you opt out in Canada, you still have to pay those union dues. And that's what being part of a union is. You have to pay into it. It's, it depends on the organization. It can be pretty expensive. But in other countries where people can opt out and not be part of a union, it makes the unions much weaker and they actually don't achieve the types of results you could. Okay, let's move on to collective bargaining. What is collective bargaining? So collective bargaining is a negotiating process that unions and employers use to arrive at an agreement, achieving a new agreement or renewing an old agreement. And it can take time. If negotiation is too difficult, then the parties can agree. The employer, the union, or the Ministry of Labor can appoint somebody like a mediator to help them achieve their goal. That doesn't always work, but it is an option. All right, what is a strike? A strike is a refusal of employees to work, walking off the job. And you've probably seen lots of strikes around education and teachers. Okay, the purpose of a strike is to call attention to the employer that something the employees think is unfair. And the only way to address it is through striking and then hopefully with a mediator through collective bargaining. Okay, so a strike is when the employees walk out. A lockout comes from the people who run the organization. It's from the management. Okay, so a lockout is when action by the employers prevent the workers from working. And you might see this in education as well, where they lock the doors and the teachers can't enter the building until an agreement is reached. So it occurs when the management stops the employees from working. Usually it occurs because they're resisting the demands that the employees are trying to negotiate in their contract. So employees at that point are barred from entering the workplace until they agree on the terms. So I'm going to give you a chance. I'm going to give you like 5 minutes. We're going to read through the history of unions in Canada. And it's sort of in Canada, the labor movement timeline in Canada started around 1872 when the Toronto printers went on strike. This is sort of more of an Ontario perspective. In 1883, the Trades and Labor Congress, a Canadian-wide federation union, was formed. Then in 1912, there was a great coal strike in Vancouver. Okay, 1919, there was a general strike in Winnipeg, not too far from here. 1932, the Commonwealth Federation was formed, and it was the first socialist party in North America. So you can go ahead and read that yourself. We're just going to go through the timeline today. 1956, the Canadian Labour Congress was formed. The TTC is a Toronto Transit Commission, was 1998. So you can see like it's slowly and gradually built across Canada. Now let's take a quick look at the myths and realities around unions. So although attitudes have changed quite a bit since 1872, the Toronto printers strike, the value of unions is still being debated. So some people think unions are a terrible waste and that, we have enough. But other people believe that unions are super important. They're the reason why we have the things we have now is because of unions. So the following table below shows the myths about unions published by the Ontario Federation of Labour's Workers. And their opinions, just remember they're all opinions. You might have heard or shared them before. And while we're reading through them, are they reality? Does that make sense? So here's myths about unions. People say unions are always making unreasonable wage demands. Well, the reality is when unions make wage demands, they're thinking about the cost of living. Most wages do not keep up with the cost of living. Unions also know that they will have to compromise as they bargain, which affects the wage being demanded. Unions try to get their members a wage that gives them a fair standard of living. Okay? Another comment you might run into is unions are only interested in money. So that's not true. Some of the goals organized labor were better working conditions, eliminating child sweatshops, expanding public education, reducing the number of working hours. Over the years, labor has led to fight for Medicare, workers' compensation, occupational health and safety, human rights laws, pay and employment equity for men and women. So the reality is unions are not only interested in the money. Next myth, unions are strike happy. No union wants to strike. I can tell you that right now. I've been involved in unions, and strikes develop when both sides can't reach an agreement. Okay? 97 out of 100 collective agreements are negotiated by unions without a strike. Strike does not always happen. So another myth, aren't unions too big and powerful? Most Canadian unions are quite small. Together, they represent less than 40% of the country's workforce. Okay. Another one, this is a very common one. Unions protect the lazy, the people who should be fired. No union contract requires an employer to keep a worker who is lazy or incompetent or constantly absent or late. Unions just make sure dismissals are for just cause, and unions make the employer document the information. And yes, then they do have the right to fire or lay off workers that are not effective. Another one is if wage demands weren't so high, and if they accepted more concessions, more jobs would stay in Canada. Well, employers often say they must have lower wages to compete with lower wage levels in other companies. However, most employers are making profit in their current situation, and they wouldn't still be in business if that wasn't the case. So wages in other countries, particularly where they are very low and usually substandard, are even in their own economies. And you know, when we're passing out work to places like China and India where they don't have unions and the working conditions are substandard and there's children working, well, that's why we're trying to compete with this low wage, but it's really not an equitable wage. Okay, why do these myths about unions exist? Well, it's because unions make people face unpleasant realities, that there's unfairness in the workplace. Many people don't earn enough money to live on. Many people must work at jobs that don't pay enough to support their families or leave them with feelings of satisfaction. So the reality is that many people who form unions, they do this so they can try and help resolve their problems. So your task for the next little while is we're going to stop and we're going to interview, because one of the tasks you have to complete for this class is interview a unionized and a non-unionized member. And I'm going to ask some questions of a friend of mine, like I mentioned earlier, about being part of a union, because she was a teacher at part of a union and now she's working for an organization that's not part of a union. So let's spend a minute or two talking about the benefits and drawbacks of unions. So I'm just going to bring Annette into the mix. Give me 1 sec. Okay. Let me just bring you over to the screen. It's not cooperating with me today. Hang on a sec.
You're not recording it, are you?
Well, yeah, I'm gonna cut. I can cut and paste it though.
Oh, I just showed my teeth.
Oh, I wasn't paying attention to that. Okay, I'm gonna stop this recording. I'm gonna clip it together.
I just know you're gonna show everybody that I was checking my teeth. Let's start.
Okay, co-op students. I know it's weird seeing me in person, but I'm Katie. I'm the co-op teacher, and we have a special guest in class today, which is very exciting. We have Annette Berry, who was a teacher for Keewatin Patricia District School Board and was a union member, and she's also currently working for an organization called Keewatin-Okmulgee Board of Education, which is a non-unionized employer. So we're going to interview her for the two things, and you're going to use the information from this interview to do your LM 7-4 interview a union member assignment, and you're going to also do, let me find LM 7-3 interview a non-union member. So if you don't have someone to interview, I'm doing the interview for you. All you have to do is regurgitate the information in your assignment. So welcome, Annette. Thank you so much for joining. So first, let's put your union hat on. Okay. So maybe you can maybe if you could tell us what your job was with the Keewatin Patricia District School Board, and then we'll start the interview. How about that?
Okay. I had the fortune of spending my career with first Dryden Board of Education and then Keewatin and Patricia District School Board. So with a span of 28 years, I did many different things. Classroom teachers, curriculum SATs, which is a special assignment teacher. And I ended up my career in specializing in literacy, especially in intervention. And throughout that, I was involved with the union in different capacities. I first started off as a steward for my school, which is the representative for each area. It's sort of like the go-between between the members and the main union or the administrative union. And then I also created or was a chair of a status of women, which was a committee within the union. So there's different avenues, and I also participated provincially in some of the meetings down in Toronto.
Awesome. So that kind of leads to the first question, which is just a very specific sort of one-word answer. What union did you belong to? What was it called?
Well, I'm feeling kind of old here because the union first was FWTAO, which was Federation of Women Teachers Association of Ontario, and we were deemed illegal because it was exclusive to women only. So we were then merged with the other union, which is mostly the male representatives. So we are now, or was, part of ETFO, which is the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. So that's what it currently is.
So, okay, then when you were working for KPDSB, were all employees required to join the union?
Yes, that is mandatory. And I know some of the members, because there's membership fees, you have to be belonging to ETFO. So yes, that is mandatory. And also, but to your advantage as well.
Yeah, and so was every staff member in that building, did they all belong to the same union?
No, in most of the school systems, there are different unions for different positions. The support staff would have a different union. I think some
would have a different one too, right?
And pardon?
The custodians would have a different union as well?
Yeah, so provincially, ETFO covers the teachers and early childhood educators. There's also some of the support staff who belong to the high school board for union. It really depends on the provincial area that you're working for or the school board that you're working for. So the Catholic board does not have their ECEs as part of their union. They are a separate union that is not part of the teachers. So it depends on where you are and which school board you're working for.
Very good. Okay, but what about, have you been involved in a negotiation for a collective agreement with KPDSB? Let's think about one that that did not have any major issues, like it was a very smooth transition. Were you involved in a collective agreement negotiation that went well, and can you tell us about it?
Actually, no, that's administrative, like those are the elected positions that you could run for. As I said, I put my name forward to be a steward. I would collect information and data from our members in my school, and I would present them to the admin. But we had a collective agreement negotiating team that were trained to do that. So I was never a part of that.
How about, have you ever, as an educator with your union, been involved in a strike or a lockout? And can you kind of describe what that all plays out like for you as a teacher?
Yes, I have been involved in most of the strikes that have happened provincially. We've also had it was the Dryden Union before we amalgamated with Keewatin and Patricia District School Board. So it is a little stressful because you are without pay. There is a lot of pressure for you to participate in the strike. There are some people that did not and would cross the picket line to go to work, even though there were no students, but they wanted to maintain their paychecks, I guess.
So that's possible? You can actually be on strike, and if you do cross the picket line, you'll still get paid?
Correct, but it at a cost socially and also with your union. So it is, I mean, it
That
is
may impact your support
you
later.
legally can do what you want as a member, but they really encourage us that united we stand together. There's more power when we're all negotiating for the same ideal, because then that person that crossed the picket line will benefit from the loss of our pay that we really felt strongly about. But everybody has a different circumstance. And that was very, very few. I could
Yeah.
only think of two people in my entire career that did that.
Wow. And what about a lockout? How is that? Have you been involved in a lockout, and is that different to a strike?
Um, well, okay, so a technical lockout is when the board shuts the doors on all the staff so you can't get in. I had only experienced that within the transfer from one school to another when the new school is being built. There was some concerns about materials and furniture that was leaving the old school to the new school, and we were locked out of our school, but not on a provincial lockout. So you
Okay.
might want to further investigate that. Yeah.
Okay. So when you did strike, because you said you were involved in a strike, what was the outcome of the strike? Did you achieve what the union was trying to achieve? Did it help in any way that you recall? I know it's a long time ago, but
Mm-hmm. Yes, it does help because um, all the benefits that we have now, like maternity leave, parental leave, sick benefits, those are all the things that the union negotiates on your behalf. Um, the amount of prep that you get. A lot of schools, if the union didn't insist on a certain amount of time, you would not get that prep time. All the things that when you walk into a provincial system that often the new members take for granted were at the expense of previous members who forego pay. You get a minimal amount of money just for, it's called strike pay, but we were successful in getting basically working conditions, and that's the biggest thing for teachers in particular. The amount of supervision time that we were allotted to take and the amount of time that had to be dedicated to staff meetings, that was all negotiated by our union.
oh wow. So you kind of answered the next two questions. So I mean, you could maybe just make one statement about how you feel about strikes in general. Like tomorrow, someone came to you and said, Annette, you're going on strike. How does that make you feel?
Okay, so prior to have that happening, the union always takes a vote first with the members.
Oh, good.
Our union would never enforce a vote without talking to the members. It's part of the collective agreement as well. So we take what we call a strike vote that is tallied, and then we have our mandate. So we never get 100%, but we are looking for in the 90s to be, the stronger the percentage, the stronger that the administration or the board realizes that we have that many people that feel strongly about this, that is a possibility. That is usually the first route, the strike vote. Nobody, including the board and the teachers, want to go on strike.
Okay.
And so it's usually when the issues are such that we can't come to an agreement, and that's when the strike vote, that's when the strike happens. And we work really hard in the union level to make sure that doesn't happen. But at a certain point, if you're not getting anywhere with the board, then that is usually what your last straw is.
Okay, fair. Okay, so last question around being a union member with your union member hat on. Do you feel like the services you received from the union while you were employed as a union member justified the dues that you paid to be a member? Now, I know your husband's looking at you right now going, no way. But like, how do you feel? Because I mean, generally, I don't even remember when I was part of a union how much it was. I want to say it was like 300-ish a month. I think it was pretty
It's pretty
substantial. Yeah.
substantial, and that is why you will often have members trying to opt out of it. But if you are hired with the board, that is part and parcel. So if you're ever in a situation where you do have union dues, that is where getting involved with the union, taking up any professional development that is available to you, is one way that you can feel that you're getting your money's worth with your union. And there is, with that union, there's also legal representation. In the
And
event
support,
that you
right?
get
Yeah.
into a situation The union has legal people on staff that will advise you and advocate for you, and if something serious of a serious nature happens to occur.
So it's not even a board level thing. Personally, if you have an issue in a school as a teacher and the union is also there to support you and help meet and mediate during meetings, which, yeah, that's true. That is a really good point with the unions. Not
Yes.
that many teachers run into that, but definitely having that support behind you
Yeah,
is good.
exactly. So if for some reason you can't come to an agreement with your principal, you feel that they're being unreasonable, and you look at your union and your collective agreement, then you involve your union. And if they feel it's grievable, that's what happens. You with your representative put in a grievance to the board that this has occurred and that you want this rectified, or to find a mutually agreeable solution.
Okay, good to know. All right, so now we're going to take off your union hat and we're going to introduce Annette Berry, who is currently working as a non-union member, which is kind of a unique position to be in because lots of people who stick with unions are there for life, right?
Mm.
So, okay, I'm going to ask you the same question, but with your non-union hat. What are the benefits of not being part of a union? What do you enjoy about not being part of a union?
There is more freedom in the roles that you perform. In the past, when I had approached administration to change hours around to accommodate more after school support, I was not allowed within the parameters because of the union to change my work hours. With not a union, you have the flexibility of moving that around. So if I wanted to maybe provide evening support, if that was what I wanted, I could shift my hours around. So I find with not a union, there's a lot more flexibility.
Okay. So have there been any situations in the company you currently work for that may have been resolved more positively if a union was established?
Um, that's a good question. One of the things about unions, it sets out the workday, the expectations, the hours. When you don't have a union, and you get a little clause at the bottom says, and other duties as requested, that is leaving you open to a lot of interpretation as far
Okay.
as weekends, evenings. So you have to establish that clearly when you start with them. What are the expectation of the hours? Is there after hours expectations? Is there weekends? Are they flexible with moving their days around? So that takes a little bit of negotiation. Like with a union and how it's laid out, that's how it's laid out.
It's sort of done for you. Yeah. So okay, and then that sort of leads us to the next question. So how are contracts and raises and those kinds of things, how do they get negotiated at with a non-unionized workplace? Like if you are realizing that inflation has gone up and your expenses have skyrocketed, who do you talk to about getting a raise? How does that happen? Who advocates for you? How does that work in a non-unionized place?
Okay. If there is nothing set within your contract about depends on the operation. Some contracts are term, like year to year. Some contracts are has a set amount of time. You have to basically advocate for yourself. If with the teachers, even with this non-union, there is a grid, what we call, it's the same as a provincial, the number of years of experience that you have. This is where you would start. And then every year for that cost of living that you're talking about or inflation, the salary goes up. And then you hit a max. So if that's laid out in your contract, great. If it's not, then it's up to the individual to approach their boss to say, I have done this and this and this. I think my value is important to this company. Is it possible for me to get a raise?
And there's benefits and drawbacks to that too, I guess, because knowing that it's in your hands, you can like make a case and hope that that is understood by your manager. But in saying that, with non-union, when you go to a manager says no, it sort of stops there. So you either find another job or
Yeah.
have what you have. Okay.
So you don't go through that with the union because it is very clear what happens set out, right? So And so, I mean, there's the security of that knowing is nice. But I also like the flexibility of a non-union because,
So yeah, no, go ahead. Because why?
because sometimes doing the same thing and over again and it's not working, then you have to think differently.
Yeah.
So the uniqueness about a non-union job is that you can think outside the box and you can provide the services that you think are needed rather than what you're not restricted to what you can
The
provide.
parameters aren't really as strict. Yeah, that makes sense. So actually, this is a good question because it may have had some impact on you. So not that long ago, KPDSB, the public school board, did go on strike. I want to say a couple of years ago. So while they were on strike, you were actually working for Kobe,
Mhm.
So was Kobe affected at all by the teachers in Sioux Lookout, for example, being on strike and you being working for an organization that was not unionized? Were you impacted by that provincial strike at all?
Um, Only in like peripheral fringe ways, staff that maybe had children that were now home. We have a partnership with KP. So our EPP was part of like training for getting teachers to get their NTIP. That was all strict, that was all
Yeah.
stopped. We couldn't do meetings with KP. So that impacted us that way. So we had to like work around that. But not like in the future, if we didn't have that partnership or other organizations, that would not have impacted what we do because the federal system is very different than the provincial.
Okay, good to know. And we've been learning lots in this course actually about even like Employment Standards Act and how federal standards are not the same as provincial. And so, yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so strike lockout. Okay, so and we've heard about work stoppages, we've heard about strikes and lots of job action. Not sure why this question is in here, but when you hear about these stoppages in the news as a non-union member, let's say, so non-union hat on here, which work action or strike lockout have you followed the most closely and why? So as a non-union member, what strike lockout or union action has impacted you the most and that you followed the most in general? It doesn't have to be education.
Okay. Well, I live in Sioux Lookout, so there has been several CN strikes over the years, and it's been very visible if you go downtown. And the post office, because especially the post office affects the general public, maybe more so than CN, because we're not aware of the ultimate impact of the train stopping, but we're very, very much aware of when our mail stops or we can't go in to purchase things. So as that in most of my life, being a union member, we often will support other unions by going out and picketing with them, walking, bringing them food, making our unions usually donate to their unions to help spread if there's families that need extra money. So there's almost like I'm not going to say brotherhood, but I'm going to say sisterhood of understanding and feeling that maybe it's going to be us next time. So you support and help as much as you possibly can.
Okay, so we're going to think back before you were ever a teacher. I don't know, if it wasn't that long ago. So I know that you've worked in other jobs as a non-unionized employee in the hospitality industry. So back then, how have your like what was different about your attitude towards striking and being a non-unionized employee when you saw unions go out on strike? And
Often the media portrays it as a money grab, they're only after money, etc. But I often want to know what exactly they're, especially if it's working conditions. I think people are more sympathetic to a union if what they're trying to do is improve the conditions of their workplace, as opposed to more money, right? Sometimes there's a bit of a pushback from the communities or from society if okay, I wish I could get more money too, but I can't go on strike. Like often we would get that from the not hospitality, but the hospitals,
Yeah.
because they can't strike because they're an essential service. And at one point they were even talking of making teaching an essential service so that it would handcuff anybody in the future trying to strike and negotiate. So,
Which
um,
makes
and sometimes small businesses, maybe they'd like to strike for higher prices, right? I don't know. It really depends on your personal situation and where you are and what perspective you have had. I grew up in a union family. I remember being like having my father go on strike. I didn't understand it, but we had powdered milk. We didn't have as much food in the house because they were on strike.
wow.
And that's all I remember, is that we had to do with less because my father was on strike and I didn't understand all the ramifications. But, and I had it personally drilled in that you do not cross a picket line. But that's my,
Okay, so that's a good last question. Okay. So if the opportunity arose to unionize in your current workplace, would you vote in favor of it or against it, and why? Or why
mm,
not? So if someone came to you tomorrow and said, Annette, we're starting a union. Let's
well,
do it. What's your reaction? What are you gonna say?
my reaction is the federal system is not the same as the provincial system. And that would have to be, I don't think you would have the collective large unions that you would have, let's say, in the provincial systems, because every community is autonomous. They can decide for themselves what they want to do. So one community may decide they want to do something like that, but another community may not. So um, I would basically say to somebody, you better do your homework and find out if this is really something that the community wants,
Yeah.
or because otherwise I don't think it would be worthwhile. Because if people are not on board and they want this, then I don't really think it's going to serve the purpose that it was originally intended for.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I super appreciate it. And yeah, I think the students have lots to work with. You gave lots of really good feedback, and they'll all get A's on their assignments now. So.
I hope so. There you go. Okay. Have a great day, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Annette. I'll call you
Bye.
later. Bye.